Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Perkenalkan, nama saya Resti Sidik dengan NPM 2435106008. Pada video kali ini saya akan mengikuti tutorial ExpressJS yang telah diberikan, eh, di mana video ini merupakan materi yang wajib saya ikuti. Saya akan langsung saja untuk memulai video pembelajarannya.
Important library for backend development in Node.js. You know why? Because it makes your backend code so easy to develop. Also, many big
Itu
companies
banyak
like
perusahaan besar
Netflix
seperti
and
Netflix
Uber
dan
use
Uber menggunakan
Express in
Express
their
di bagian
backend.
backend
And another
mereka,
big
dan
reason
alasan besar
is
lainnya adalah
it is a
karena ini
part of
merupakan
MERN
bagian dari
and E
main
stack.
dan
This E
main stack.
represent
Huruf E
as
ini mewakili
Express.js.
Express.js.
So here is the
Jadi inilah
Express.js crash
kursus
course in which you will learn how to
kursus kita
create RESTful
ExpressJS, di
APIs
mana
like
kita akan belajar
get,
cara membuat
post,
API
put,
RESTful seperti
patch,
get,
and
post,
delete.
put,
In
patch,
short,
dan
all
delete.
CRUD
Singkatnya
APIs.
semua API
After that, you
CRUD,
will learn how to
CRUD.
validate the data, sending errors, returning proper status code like 404 not found, 201 for
Saya diharapkan
success,
dapat
etc.
memvalidasi data,
Also, additionally, you will
mengirimkan
learn
pesan
about
error pada
middlewares
server.
and how
Kita
to
juga
create new
dapat
middlewares
belajar
in
middleware dan
Express,
cara membuat
which is
middleware
very
sendiri di
helpful
Express,
and advanced
yang
concept.
merupakan konsep yang sangat
Also,
bermanfaat
you
dan
will learn
canggih.
much more
Selain itu
about
kita akan
Express.
mempelajari lebih banyak
So
tentang
after
Express.
completing
Jadi
this crash course, you will
ya,
gain
kita akan
clarity
langsung
and
saya mulai pada
confidence
kursus
for
kali ini.
using Express. You will learn all these things step by step, so everything will clear to you and you can understand Express in details. So let's start with building RESTful APIs. But before
Kita
that,
akan
do
bangun
you
API
know
RESTful
what
terlebih
is the
dahulu.
difference
Namun
between
sebelum itu,
simple
tahukah
API
apakah
and
apa
RESTful
perbedaan antara
API?
API sederhana dan
Let's
API
quickly see
RESTful?
that
Mari
first.
kita lihat itu dulu dengan cepat.
Now, as we know, API stands for Application Programming Interface, and it is the way for two programs communicate with each other. In simple words, API is used to transfer data between frontend to backend and backend to frontend. We already know that, right? Now you might ask, what is
Sekarang
REST
kita
API?
lihat apa
So
itu
REST
REST
API
API. Jadi
stands
REST
for
API adalah singkatan
Representational
dari
State Transfer
Representational
API.
State
REST
Transfer
API is a
API. REST
specific way
API
of
adalah cara
building a
khusus
simple
untuk
APIs.
membangun API
Don't worry about its
sederhana.
name, it's very simple. So REST API is the same API, but we have to follow some rules to build that API. If we follow some rules, that simple
Ada
API
beberapa syarat
becomes
antara
REST API.
API
Now
dengan
let's see some rules
REST API
which we have to
tersebut.
follow to make REST API. One rule is we have to define separate API URL for each piece of
Salah
data.
satunya
For
kita
example,
dengan
suppose we are
bisa
creating
untuk setiap
API
bikin
for
data,
user-related
misalnya
operations
grafik
like
mau
register a
untuk
user, getting the
first
information of
rekomendasi
single
seperti
user,
berapa
etc.
pemenang
In
atau
this case,
informasi
our API
mengenai
should be our domain name
bagi kita
and
sesuatu
then
pemenang
slash
dan
user
internet.
for
Jadi
register.
sebenarnya yang
And if
pemenang
we
untuk
want to get
pendaftaran itu
information about single
kita
user,
ingin
then
mendapatkan
we create
informasi
API
tentang
URL like
pemenang, maka
slash
kita
user
membuat
slash
API
123.
seperti
Here, 123 is a user unique ID. Same as if we create API related to products, then our URL should be like this: slash products
seperti
slash
ini.
products slash 123 slash products slash add to cart, etc. So by simply looking at this API URL, we get the basic idea related to our APIs, and by that, we can easily do changes and our application stay clean. Another rule is different types of actions like reading, adding, updating, or deleting data should use specific HTTP methods. Now you might ask, what are HTTP methods? So as we know, HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and it allows our frontend to request and receive web pages and other resources from servers using API. So only because of HTTP,
Jadi
we
hanya
are
karena
able to
HTTP
send
kita
and receive
dapat
data
mengirim
from backend using
mengirim
API.
data dan
Now
menggunakan
this
API.
HTTP
Sekarang
has
nanti
5 main methods:
kelima
get,
yang
post,
pertama
put,
dapatkan
patch, and delete.
get.
Let me explain you this one by
Yang
one.
saya
First one is the get method. We use get method
dan
when we want to only
terkait
get
ketika
data
hanya
from
ingin
the server.
mengambil data
For
dari
example,
server.
we want to
Sebagai
get
contoh,
all
kita
users
ingin
details, or we want to
data
get
semua
all products
pengguna
details,
atau
or we want
detail
to get
semua
single
produk
product detail.
atau detail
In this
suatu
case,
produk
we
atau
define our
barang.
API with get
Jadi
method.
kita dengan
For
metode
understanding
get
these methods,
untuk
we will use
untuk
analogy of library. So
mengenali
get method is
perpustakaan.
like
Jadi
asking a
metode get itu
librarian
seperti
to show
minta
you a
perpustakaan
book
untuk
or
menunjukkan
multiple
sebuah
books.
buku atau
Don't worry about
beberapa buku kepada
implementation,
kita.
we will
Jadi
see all methods step by
dalam
step in
semua
this
metode
section.
yang tadi melangkah
Second,
begini
we have
ini.
post method.
Kedua, kita
We use
memiliki
post
metode
method
post.
when we
Kita
want to
menggunakan
post
metode
or
post
send some
ketika ingin
data
mengirim
from
atau
frontend to
memposting
create a new
data
data in our
dari
server.
front
For
end untuk
example,
membuat data
for
baru di
register
server
a new
kita.
user,
Sebagai
we have
contoh,
to send user data from our
dimana kita
frontend,
harus
and
mengirimkan
that
data
will create a
pengguna
new
dari
data
sisi
in our
front
server.
itu akan
Think it's
untuk
like we
membuat
create
data
new
baru
book
di
to
sisi
librarian
front.
for add the
Kita
book in library.
akan
Next we have
baru
put method. we use put method when we want to update an existing data on the server with new data. For example, if you change your profile information on a website and save it, then a put request is sent to update your profile with the new details. Think it's like giving librarian an
Nggak ada
updated version
scrolling
of a book
install
to
terus
replace the old one.
mungkin buku
Next,
yang
we
lama
have patch
selanjutnya
method.
kita
We
bikin
use
metode
patch method
fetch
when
kita
we want to
menggunakan
update
metode
a piece of small
fetch
data,
kita kayak
not
gini
entire
bro.
data. For example, if we want to update just our email address in our profile without changing anything else, then a patch request can be used. Think it's like we are giving librarian just the updated pages of a book to update, rather than replace the whole book. Imagine here we have user object in our server. We want to complete this user object, then which method we will use? Right, we use put method. And if we want to update just the password of this user, then which method we have just our profile with data, not the new profile information on a website and save it, then a put request is sent to update your profile with the new details. Think it's like giving librarian an updated version of a book to replace the old one. Next, we have patch method.
Bikin
We use
metode
patch
fetch
method
kita
when we
menggunakan
want to
metode
update
fetch
a
ketika
piece of
ingin
small data,
memperbarui
not
sebagian
entire
kecil
data.
data
For
bukan seluruh
example,
data.
if we want
Sebagai
to
contoh,
update
jika
just
kita
our
hanya
email
ingin
address in our
memperbarui
profile without
padahal
changing
kita
anything
tanpa
else, then a patch request
menghalangi, maka
can be
kita
used.
dapat
Think it's like we are giving librarian
menggunakan
just
metode
the
fetch. Sama
updated
sering
pages
seperti
of
kita
a book
menggunakan
to
halaman
update,
buku yang
rather than
berbalik itu.
replace the whole book.
Kalau ada
Imagine
mengganti
here we have
seluruh
user
buku,
object
bayangkan
in
kita
our server. We want
di
to
objek
update
misalnya
this
kita
user
ingin
object,
memperoleh
then
objek
which
mana
method we will
syarat
use?
setelah dalam tidak,
Right,
oh
we
kita
use put
metode input
method.
nih.
And if we want to update
Dan
just the
jika kita
password
hanya
of
ingin
this user,
berbeda
then
di
which method we
penggunaan
will use?
ini metode
Right, we
patch.
will use patch method. You are doing really great. So put method is used for whole data
Jadi
updates,
metode
and
put ini
patch
digunakan
method
untuk
is
memperbarui
used for
seluruh data,
updating
sedangkan metode
the
patch
existing
digunakan
data.
untuk memperbarui sebagian
Now last
kecil data
method
sudah
is
ada.
split. And you guessed
Terakhir adalah
correctly, we
menghapus
will use
data,
split
bahkan
method for delete
kita
data from the server.
itu menghapus
For
data
example,
dari
when
server.
we
Sebagai
delete a
contoh,
post
ketika
or
kita
a comment
menghapus
on
sebuah
social
unggahan
media,
atau komentar
then
di
delete
media
request
sosial,
is sent to remove it
dan
from the server.
penghapusan akan
And for
dikirim untuk
that, I
menghapus
don't think
dari
we need
server.
librarian
Nanti
emoji,
itu saya
right?
rasa
And also, it is not
oh,
practical. Think it's like asking librarian to remove a book
untuk
from
melakukan
library.
buku
So
dari
you can see
orang
HTTP
jajan
methods are very
dan
simple.
tidak
We will use these 5
kita
HTTP
akan
methods to
implement
define
tidak
our
dengan
different
untuk
types of
mendefinisikan
API.
berbagai
So
jenis
these are just
API.
few rules
Nah,
to
jadi
correct
ini
this.
hanya
But
beberapa
don't worry,
aturan
we
yang
will
saat
learn
ini
all
kita
these rules
lihat, tapi
as
yang
we
mau
build
kita akan
APIs.
pelajari semua aturan
Now you
ini
might ask
sharing.
why we need
Sekarang
REST
kita
API.
mungkin
Why
bertanya
we need
mengapa
REST
kita
API
membutuhkan
for
REST
building
API. Canda ada di apa enggak? Nggak ada di sini dong. Oh, di motor. Kunci rumah.
API. So by following any rules, we can make things organized. And that's
Jadi
true
dengan
for
menggunakan
REST
kita
API
dapat
also.
membuat segalanya
Rules
terorganisir
will
dan
make our
itu juga
API
berlaku untuk
more
RCP
organized.
aturan akan
Also,
membuat
by follow
aplikasi
REST
menjadi
API rules, we
dan
create
itu
a
dengan
simple
menjadi
and
aturan
easy to
RCP
use
kita
API because they use specific HTTP methods for doing
menggunakan
specific types of
menggunakan
work.
metode HTTP
Also,
spesifik
with
untuk
rules,
melakukan
we
jenis
can create a
pekerjaan dan
clean
tools.
and
Nah, itu
maintainable
dengan
API
karena
which
tidak ada
any developers
perjanjian
can understand
misi
and
dan
start working on them.
deklarasinya seperti
For
pengaman
now, don't worry
aturan
about rules. As I said,
yang
you will learn these rules
seperti yang
while you create
CI.
APIs. So let's start building our first Node.js project.
Jadi
I'm
mari
very
kita mulai
excited
membangun
and I
project
know you are
Node.js
too.
pertama kita di sini.
Now, before we start any project, it's better to
Sebelum
roughly
project
plan
ada
about
sebenarnya
that
kita
project.
membuat rencana
So,
kasih
as we
terlebih
know,
dahulu.
our
Jadi seperti yang kita ketahui,
first
project
project
pertama
is
kita
about
adalah
managing the
tentang
task.
mengelola
Here,
tugas
how
dan
its front end looks
inilah
like.
tampilan bagian depannya.
Also, this is the
Selain
first
itu,
project
ini
of my
adalah project
React.js course,
utama dari kursus React.js.
and we will
Saya
put
dan
this project
kita
backend
kita
as our
membangun
first
project
backend
ini
project.
sebagai project
Don't
bagian
worry,
pertama
we are
kita.
not doing
Jangan
the
khawatir,
backend and
kita tidak
frontend
akan membuat
because
front
our
end di
main
sini
focus
karena
is on
fokus
the
utama
Node.js and building the
pada
best backend
JS dan
for our
membangun bagian
applications.
terbaik
From the
untuk
front end,
aplikasi
we
kita.
just
Dari
need to
sisi
call
front end
APIs.
kita hanya perlu
Now you
memanggil
might ask,
API.
how can we plan
Sekarang kita
Node.js
mungkin
project?
bertanya, bagaimana kita bisa menceritakan project
It is
Node.js?
very simple. This is
Ini
the
sangat
method I
sederhana.
used for
Ini
planning
adalah
my
metode
backend
yang
project
digunakan
even
untuk
big projects.
merencanakan project
Instead of
bagian.
building project first
Ya,
and
bahkan
then doing major modifications,
tidak perlu
it's better to
memakai
spend little time on planning before we start our project. So
melakukan
for
sedikit
backend project,
optimasi.
if we create a list of
Jadi untuk
APIs,
project
that's very
kita
useful
ingin
because
membuat daftar
backend
API
is
itu
almost
sangat
all
berguna
about
karena
APIs.
backend hampir
So for
seluruh API. Jadi
this
untuk
project,
project
first we
yang
need the list
pertama-tama
of
kita
all tools.
membutuhkan daftar
So one
semua hal
API
yang
for
harus
getting all
dilakukan.
tools.
Jadi satu API untuk mendapatkan semua daftar tugas.
After that, we need to create API for adding a new task.
Untuk
And after
baru
that,
dan
we can
setelah itu
update the
kita dapat
single task
memperbarui itu
details.
detail
So
tugas
one
tunggal.
API
Jadi
for
satu
updating
API
the task.
untuk
And at the end, we need to delete single to do. So another API for delete specific task. So currently we know we need these 4 APIs and we will create 2-3 extra APIs for practice. If while building project we need to create more APIs, then we will create more APIs. There is nothing wrong about that. This is just a rough plan for reduce the confusion. Now let's create a fresh application for our
Kita ke sini.
project. So open
Sekarang mari kita buat aplikasi terekam kan.
the folder in which
Folder nanti kita butuh yang di dasar, dokumen, workflow, terempat, pengalaman web, teori. Ini masuk mana ya? Kita buat di sini. Oh, tuh. Dia ExpressJS. Ini video part ke-6. Video 6. Masuk.
you want to create project, and I name it as task track, and simply open this folder in the VS Code.
Oh, oke. Gimana dia buka?
This is track in which you want to create. Simply open this folder in the VS Code.
Mau. Sini, Cuk. Ini apa sih ini? Iya. Self command. Gini aja ya. Wah, ada ya? Buka installer VS Code. Ini ini lagi dong. Nah, oke, ada pas.
This is the name of our project. Is it sounds good? I hope it is. If you have better name, then you can
Kadang
also
kadang
use
biar
it.
ada juga
It's
dapat
totally up to you. Now what we have to do for creating Node.js applications. Do you remember? We just did that in our previous section. Yes, simply we open our terminal and initialize our project using npm init. And for all yes, we will use dash y here.
ah, hmm, belum habis sih.
See, we get package.json file with some default config. Here we can see our main file is index.js, which is the file runs when we start our application. So let's create index.js file, and that's it. Here in this file we will write code for our backend.
Ini adalah kamu. Bukan. Ini adalah kau. Dan kamu ingin menaklukkan dunia, Albion?
So in the previous section, we create our server using HTTP module. And the problem with the HTTP module is we have to define our different API endpoints in this if and else if statements, which is not very clear and also not easy to maintain for big projects. So that's why we
Jadi
use
dalam
very
mengerti kita
popular
menggunakan
package
paket
or
atau
module
modul yang
called
sangat populer nama
express.js.
express.js.
Express.js
Ini
is
bersifat
minimal and
minimalis
flexible
dan
for
fleksibel
creating
untuk
better
membuat
node
net
applications.
yang lebih baik.
In simple words, by
Singkatnya,
using
dengan menggunakan
express.js,
express.js,
we can simplify our
kita dapat
routes,
menyederhanakan
we can
UT
easily
kita.
handle HTTP
UT kita
request
dapat
and
dengan mudah
response,
menggunakan permintaan dan
feedbacks, and
respon
much more
HTTP,
things.
middleware, dan
Let
banyak
me
hal
show you
lainnya.
something.
Izinkan saya menunjukkan
Here
sesuatu.
is the express package
Adalah
on npm.js website. We can
mana nih?
see its weekly downloads are almost 37.2 million, which is crazy.
Sungguh luar
And
biasa
almost
dan
in
hampir di
90% of Node.js
90%
projects,
proyek Node.js
developers use
mengembang
Express
menggunakan
package.
paket
So it is
Express.
very
Jadi,
important to
menguasai
master
Express itu
Express,
sangat penting.
right? First of all, let's
Nah,
install
mari
this
kita install
module
modul
in
ini
our project.
di project
So
kita.
open up
Jadi, buka
terminal
terminal
and write
dan
npm
ketik
install
dan
Express.
install.
At the time I am recording this course, its latest
Sini
version
isi
is
programnya adalah
5.1.0. If you want to get the same
1.0.
experience
Jika
as
Anda
I am
mendukung
getting, then you can write here npm install
program
express @ 5.1.0 and hit enter.
Oh,
Don't worry about Express, it is really simple package. Done. Now we want to use this Express module in this index.js file. Can you tell me what we have to do? Right, we will import the Express module using require function express, and this require function returns a function.
mengambil masih mengambil fungsi.
So we simply store it in variable called express. Now to create an express application, we call this express function here, which returns a object, and we store it in variable called application or app. You can give it any other name, but probably all developers called it app. So let's go with app. Now in this app object, we get many useful methods. For example, we have here app.get, app.post, app.put, app.patch, app.delete, etc. Do you remember where we see these 5 methods? Right, they are HTTP methods for creating different types of API. So if we want to define our API for HTTP GET method, then we use app.get. If we want to define HTTP delete method, then we use app.delete. Same as we can create post, put and patch request. The way to define all these 5 methods are the same. Still, we will see all methods in this section one by one. For now, let's start with get request. So in this get method, at the first parameter, we have to write our API endpoint name. Suppose we want to define get API for URL http localhost 3000 /todos. Now what is our endpoint in this URL? Right, /todos is our API endpoint, and that's what we have to write here at the first parameter. Make sure we add here / first, otherwise this will not work properly. Now what if we want to define get API for URL http localhost 3000, which is the root URL of our website. At that time, we can add here only /, which represents root endpoint. Now we have to define what will happen when our front end sends request to this endpoint. Do you remember? Let me show you. Here we pass callback function, and in this we get 2 objects, request and response. This request has all details about URL request, and with this response object we can send response related details. We already seen this in HTTP module lesson. Now what we want to send when someone sends request on this API. For now, we simply return a text response.send task track project. So when someone sends get request on this endpoint, this function will run and then it simply returns this text in response. Simple as that. So by these 2 lines, our Express server is created. But we have to run or listen this server on some port. If we don't listen our server, then our API will not work. So here at the end we write app.listen, and simply here we pass our port number, and at the second parameter we again pass callback function which will run when our server started listening on this port. So here we can simply console.log server is running or listening on this port 3000. Save the changes and let's run our index.js file. Write node index.js. See, server is listening on this port 3000. Nice. Now back to browser and run localhost or listening on this port 3000. Save the changes and let's run our index.js file. Write node index.js. See, server is listening on this port 3000. Nice. Now back to browser and run localhost colon 3000, which is the root URL, and see, here we get task track project tags which we send from our server. You can see Express makes our code really simple. We can compare our current code with the previous HTTP module code. Express makes it really simple. Also, this is our first API, that's why we return only tags in response. Now as we move forward in our project, real thrill will start.
Introducing ClickUp Super Agents, the world's first AI agents that natively collaborate with humans and always have correct context and perfect memory.
Now let's create API for getting all to-dos list. Can you tell me which HTTP method we have to use? Right, for getting the data from the server, we use get HTTP method. So here we write app.get, and let's say we want to give this API name to-dos. So we pass here slash to-dos, and after that at the second parameter we pass callback function which has two parameters, request and response. See, for all APIs this structure will stay the same, only this HTTP method change, this endpoint change, and logic inside this callback function will change. That's how ExpressJS makes our project simple and clean. Now currently we are not going to work with the database because we don't want to add extra complexity for our first project. We will learn all these things step by step, so don't worry about database. Now here we have to send all to-dos array. So at the top I define one dummy data called to-dos array and simply add some to-dos in this. So here every to-do is object with 4 properties. ID, let's set it to 1. Task, which is the text of task, let's say create all APIs for project 1. Tags, which are the tags related to task, which is an array, Node.js, comma, JavaScript. And status to do. These properties ID, task, tags, status is defined by Node.js developer, which means you. What you want to call it, how many properties you need, these things you have to decide based on which data we want to store and which data we don't want. Now let's duplicate this object 2 more times using shift plus alter plus down arrow or shift plus option plus down arrow. Now we change this ID to task to create API for list of all to-dos, tags, Node.js, and status to doing. And at last we simply change ID to 3, task to plan project 1, tags, JavaScript, and status to done. Now we want to simply return this array as a response when someone sends get request to API with slash to-dos endpoint. So what we write here? Right, we write response.send and simply pass our to-dos array. Save the changes and let's verify this API is working or not. Open terminal, close the current running server using Ctrl plus C and again run this file. Now in the browser, at the place of root website, we simply call slash to-dos endpoint. See, here we get our array. So that's how simple to send data from the backend using GET API. Now currently, when we do some change in our project, we have to close our previous running server and restart our application, which is really annoying. So for automatically restart our application, we have one package called nodemon. It is really useful. So open up terminal and write npm install or i-g nodemon. Here we use -g for installing this nodemon package globally. Otherwise, we have to install nodemon in every node project. Also, if you are using Mac, then for installing global package, you have to is really annoying. So for automatically restart our application, we have one package called nodemon. It is really useful. So open up terminal and write npm install or i-g nodemon. Here we use -g Now currently we are manually setting the port of our server, but in the real world that port is set by environment in which our application is running. Specifically, it's managed by the hosting provider or development platforms like Render, Heroku, AWS, etc. So when we deploy our application on these platforms, our 3000 port might be already used by another server. At that time, if we hard-coded our port, then our server will not run on that port and it will give us error in the deployment. So what is the solution here? It is really simple. We will check one condition. If in our application environment port variable is defined, then we use that port variable, else we use our hard-coded port. Let me show you, it is really simple. So here, before we listen our server, we create a variable called port equals to. Now here, how can we check our server has port in its environment or not? So for that, we have one object called process.env. This env is for environment. In this environment, we get all variables which are set by hosting platforms and .port for port variable. So if any hosting platform want to set different port, then they will store them in this process.env.port variable. That's common convention. Also, all environment variable name is all capital letters, and that's why we also give this variable name as all capital port. So just by looking at it, we know it can be environment variable. Now if this process.env.port is available, then no issue. But if it is not available or set, then we have to pass our hard-coded port value. So we add here OR operator, which is bar symbol 2 times. It is the key above enter or return. And here we pass our port, which is 3000. Now let's pass this port variable at the place of this hard-coded port, and also we will change this console message. Let's make this string as template string using backticks, because in template strings we can easily access variable and change this 3000 with curly brackets port. So if this environment port is available, then we use it, or if it is false or null, then we use this 3000 port. Simple as that. Currently in our application, environment port is not set. That's why our application will run continuously on port 3000. Don't worry if you are little confused about this process.env. We will see it in details in the upcoming projects. Now let me give you one shortcut for setting up Node application. First, required express, create express application, create this port variable using this expression, and listening the express application on the port. These 4 things will stay the same in all Node applications. Yes, we can add more functionality in other lines, but nothing will change in these 4 lines.
This is the most relaxing game in 2025.
Of all to-dos in our application. But what if we need to get the information about only single to-do, like to-do with ID 1 or ID 3? For that, we need to pass ID in API URL. So our API URL look like this, /todos/1, which means we want to fetch one to-do information whose ID is 1. This type of variable which we pass in our URL is called as route parameter, and it is very important for providing the specific information about API request like ID, status, date, anything. Let me show you how we can set this type of API URL and access the route parameters. So we add new get API and endpoint to /todos/. Now here, for defining route parameter, we use colon and give our route variable name like id. So this id is our route parameter. We can call it anything like to do id, but id is short and sweet, so we go with id. And that's it. That's how we can define route parameter in our API URL. Now let's access this route parameter in our API logic. Again, we add here callback function with two parameters, request and response. Now inside this function, what do you think? In which object we get information about our route parameter, request or response? Right, we get information about route parameter in request. So request.params. In this params object, we will get all route parameters and we can access it by .id. See, here we get also auto suggestions. Now let's simply send this id in our response.send. Save the changes and back to our browser. Head over to localhost 3000 /todos/1 and see, here we get id 1. So we are successfully getting the route parameter. Now here is the one thing. We can also pass multiple route parameters in our API. For example, we can pass task status to do. Now in the backend, we add here route parameter. And how can we do that? Right, we add /status. And how can we access route parameter? Right, we use request.params.status. Let me show you whole route params object. Save the changes and back to browser. We pass here status value after our id value. Make sure the order is the same as we defined in our API, which means first id and then status. See, here we get the params object with those two properties which we defined in API. Now you might have curiosity, what if we don't pass here status? Let's also see that. Remove the status value and see, here we get cannot get /todos/1, which means our server didn't found API with this URL. So if we define route parameters in our API, then make sure we will pass all route parameters in right order. Now there is another way to pass data in URL, which is by using query parameters. If you are using websites, then in URL you might see question mark and then pass some types of variables like short equals to date and order equals to ASC for ascending, etc. These are the query parameters which is used for passing data in URL. Now you might ask, what is the difference between route parameters and query parameters? Both are used to pass data in URL, but route parameters are used to pass data which is must required, where query parameters are used to pass data which are additional or optional. In simple words, in our API, if frontend didn't pass route parameters, then our API will give us error. But if we didn't pass query parameters, then our API will not give us error. It is an additional details. In our example, if we didn't pass to-do ID or status, then it will give us error that API not found. But if we don't pass these variables after the question mark, then we don't get error. Now let me show you how we can access these query parameters in our API. So for that, we don't need to change anything in the API URL. We can directly access them in our callback function. So for query parameter, we have another object in request, which is request.query. And that's it. We don't need to do anything in our endpoint. Save the changes and take a look. See, here we get the query object. So request.params is used for route parameters and request.query is used for query parameters. We will use them a lot when we build complex APIs. They are very useful.
Gimana ya cara bikin karakter kayak game gini?
Now let's see how we can return single to do by its ID. So for that, what we use? Route parameter or query parameter. Right, we will use route parameter because that information is must required. So we remove this slash status from our endpoint, we don't need it. And in the callback function, we need to return the single to do which ID is the same as our route parameter ID. First of all, let's store the route parameter in separate variable. So const to do ID equals to, how can we access route parameters? Right, request.params.id. Now we have to find the single to do from our to do's array which ID is same as this to do ID. For that, we use one JavaScript array method which is find. So to do's array dot find, and inside this find method we pass callback function, and here in the parameter we get the single to do object as t. So this t is this single object in the to do's array, and we return here condition if t.id equals to our to do id. If you don't know this find method, then let me explain you in short because it is pure JavaScript concept. So this find method will check our to do's array, and first it will pick the first object of the array in this t variable. Then we check the condition t.id is same as our to do id. If it is true, then this find method will return that single object. So we store in variable const to do. And also, if this condition is not satisfied, then it will set t as next object and then again check the condition. And that's how we can find single to do using this find method. Let's also send this to do in response.send method. Save the changes and take a look. Let's remove these query parameters and also status value. And here we don't get anything. Why? We pass id 1, and in our to do's array we also have to do with id 1. Then what is wrong? Let's try to console this single to do. Save the changes and refresh the page on browser. Now in our VS Code terminal where we are running our server, we get our consoles. See, here we get undefined. So we cannot find to do from our to do's array, and that's the error. May this error occur because we are not comparing the IDs properly. Let's also try to console this to do ID type using type of to do ID. This will return the type of to do ID. Save the changes and refresh the page. Back to VS Code, and see, here we get undefined for single to do, and we get type string for to do ID. And that's why we are not getting single to do, because here our to do ID is integer and we are comparing it with the string. So we have to convert this to do ID string into integer. So we can wrap this request.params.id with parse integer. This parse integer function will convert our string into integer. Save the changes and take a look. Refresh the page and see, here we get the single to do object with id 1. If we pass here id 3, then we get here to do with id 3. So it's working. Good. Now you might ask, in the route parameter we are passing 1 as integer, but why in the backend we get it as a string? So the truth is, whatever we pass in the URL, it is passed as string. So if we want to pass something as integer, then we have to convert it in the backend. We can't pass integer value using route parameter, and it is also true for query parameters. So always remember, when you define route parameters or query parameters, then you have to convert its value using parse integer or parse float method. I intentionally create this error to show you what might happen when we create API and access ID in the route parameter. Now let's create post API for adding a new to do object. So as we know, for creating new data on server, we use post API. And also in post request, frontend will send data to the server. For example, here we create post API for adding a new to-do. So our frontend will send details about the to-dos like task, tags, and status in the body of that request. Without this information, how can we add new to-do in our to-dos array, right? Don't worry, let me show you this practically. So here we define post API using app.post, and at the first argument we pass our endpoint. Let's pass slash to-dos, and at the second argument we pass callback function with two parameters, request and response. Now you might ask, these two endpoints are same. How can we use these APIs individually? So here we can see this API used get method, and this second API is used post method. So when frontend send API request on this endpoint with get method, this function will run, and if frontend send API request on the same endpoint with post method, then this function will run. We will see how to send post request in just a minute. Now, as we know, from frontend, we send data in the request body. And how can we get information related to request in this function? Right, we can use this request parameter. In this request, we will get all information about that particular request. So here we have request, and in this request we have property called body. This body has all data which frontend sends with the request, which is our to-do object. So we store it in variable called to-do. And after that, simply console.log this to-do, and also response.send this to-do. Now let's test we are getting data in our to-do variable or not. Previously, we are sending simple get request from the browser URL, because by default browser send get request to the URL, but we cannot send other HTTP requests using browser URL. For that, we need front-end code, or we can use API testing software like Postman, or we can also use one VS Code extension called Thunder Client. From these three options, installing VS Code extension is much easier setup. So in this course, most probably we will use Thunder Client and Postman both, because for testing advanced API we need Postman. But don't worry, both interfaces are same. Main thing is we should able to test our API. Simple as that. So head over to extensions panel from here and search Thunder Client and install it. Now in our panel list, this Thunder Client icon is added. So let's open it, and here we can test our APIs for our project. So first of all, we enter our API URL, which is http://localhost:3000/todos. And which method we need? We need post method. So we select post from here, and now we have to pass to-do object in our request body. So for that, we select here body, and in the JSON option, here we will pass our data in object. First field we need is task. So we have to pass field name in double quotes, and also we have to pass value in double quotes. This is new task. Also, if you can't see these fields properly, then close this panel by using Ctrl+B or Command+B. After that, we need another field which is tags, and we pass here array, and in that we pass two values, HTML and CSS. And last field, status, and value, let's say to do. Now here is one thing, this field name, which is this task, tags, status, these names are set by the backend developer. Whatever name backend developer define, frontend developer should send data with the same field name. Otherwise, how in the backend we fetch data from the body of the request. Now for sending this post request, we click on the send button. See, we didn't get anything. And if we check our terminal, then also we get undefined. So why we are not getting the data in our request.body object? What we are doing wrong? So when frontend sends post request, it sends data in the body of the request in JSON format, and that's what we also did in our testing request. Now by default, Express server does not know how to automatically read and understand that JSON data. So for Express, we need a translator which will convert that JSON data in a simple JavaScript object. Because we cannot directly work with JSON data, we need to convert it in object or array which our JavaScript can understand, right? So for that, we have one middleware in Express which will work as a translator. So after this to-dos array variable, we add app.use, and in that we call our middleware express.json, and that's it. Make sure you add this middleware before our APIs, and also you have to call this express.json middleware, otherwise it will not work. So currently, without this express.json middleware, we are getting request.body as undefined. Now let's save the changes and again send post request. See, now we get our request.body same as we send this object. So this is the importance of express.json middleware. Now we have to just add this new to do in our to do's array. So we use here simple array method to do's array dot push. This will add new data at the last position of the array. And here in the push method we pass object because all our to do's is in object, and we have to follow the same object structure for the new to do. So first of all we need ID. And how can we get the ID? We didn't pass it from the front end. So for ID we can do something like this. We will get the last to do ID and increase it by 1. So to get the last to do of the list, we write to do's array in square bracket to do's array dot length, which is currently 3, but we know array index start with 0. So we have to do here length minus 1. So this to do's array in square bracket to do's array dot length minus 1 is our last to do object, and we want to access its ID. So we add here dot ID and simply increase it by 1. So if our array length is 3, then 3 minus 1, which is 2, which is the index of the last element. And then we access its ID and increase it by 1, which is 4. Simple as that. Next, we have task field, and we pass value as to do, which we get from request.body, and for accessing task, we add .task. Next, we have tags, and we pass value to do.tags. And last, we have status, which is what? Right, to do.status. Now I think this might confuse you. So we define this new to do object separately. So const new to do equals to paste this object here. And in the push method, we simply add this new to do. I think this looks more clear. Also, one thing I want to tell you, in any API at the end of the callback function, we must add response.send. Otherwise, on our front end, our request keeps running, and that's make our overall speed down. So make sure in every API we return something. Now you might ask, what should we return from the post request? So from the post request, we can return recently added data in our server or database. So our front end gets all the information like ID and use them as they want. So here we simply return this new to do, save the changes and take a look. Send the request again and see, now we are getting data with ID 4. And if we fetch all to do's from the get request, then see, we get 4 to do's. So we successfully create post request and add new to do in our to do's array. Let's quickly recap what we learned in this lesson. So we use post request for create a new data on the server, and we get that new data from the body of the post request sent by frontend. For testing that, we use this Thunder client extension and send our data in JSON format, which is the common format for sending data. Now in the backend, we need to convert that data into simple JavaScript format, and that's why we use express.json middleware and add it before our APIs. Without this express.json middleware, we are getting request.body as undefined. After that, we add the new data in separate object with its all field and then simply push it in the to-dos array. And at the end, return the new added data from response.send. Simple as that. Now in the next lesson, we will improve this post request. Now currently, our front end is sending whatever data they want to send. But what if someone don't send the required data like task tags or tags array or status? Without them, we can't add incomplete data in our storage. It's bad for our application. So in that condition, we have to add data validation in our API. So at the beginning of our API, we will check frontend is passing all the necessary data or not. If it is not passing proper data, then we stop that request immediately with proper error message. Let me show you what I mean. So here, after we are getting the data from the request.body, we add simple condition if todo.task is not available, then we return error from here. So in the curly brackets, we write response.send task is required. Now here is the one thing. Even if we write here response.send, our remaining code will also work. So to stop running the code from here, we have to add here return. Without this return, our remaining code will anyway run. So don't forget to add return. Now let's duplicate this if block 2 more times using shift plus alter plus down arrow or shift plus option plus down arrow. Now we simply change the condition for tags to do.tags and change the error message tags are required. And at last to do.status and status is required. Also, here we can check more conditions like tags should be array or task value should more than 3 characters, etc. For now, we don't want that complexity, so let's test this implementation. Save the changes, open the post test, and we simply remove this task field. Send the request, and see, here we are getting this message, task is required. Beautiful. Now front end just need to display this error message on manually validate our input fields data. But these are only 3 fields. Manually validate our input fields data. But these are only 3 fields. Imagine we have 7 to 8 fields and for each field we want to validate data. Then we have to write this if condition 7 to 8 times. So is there any other way to do that? Yes, we have special library for validating the user data. First one is Joy. This is one of the most popular and robust data validation library in Node.js. And we will also use Joy for data validation in this course. Also, there are another library like Yup and validator.js. You can use any of this library. I personally like Joy and we will use Joy in the next project. Currently, our main focus is on creating CRUD APIs, which means create, read, update, delete APIs. Now when we return an error from the server, it's better we also pass the error code with that error message. By that error or status code, our front end gets information about the success or failure of the HTTP request. You might already know about this or you might seen this error. For example, when we don't found a web page, some website display 404 not found page. This 404 is the error or status code for not found. Let's see most common error or status code for HTTP request. So first one is 200, which means all okay. This is the default status code which sent by our Express application. And in our request also, we can see here we are getting status 200 okay. Next we have 201 code, which means created successfully. So if we create a new data on our server, then we can return that data with status code 201. Can you tell in which HTTP method we can return status code 201? Right, in the post request if our data is successfully created. Next, we have status 400, which means bad request done by frontend. These include some missing or invalid or unauthorized access request. And yes, for data validation, we will return error message with this 400 status code. Next, we have 404, which means not found. Suppose we are sending GET request for getting the single to do with ID 10. Now that is not available in our data. So at that time, we can send response with 404 status code. Another important status code is 500, which means internal server error. Suppose we get some error in creating the new to-do on the server. Then at that time, we will return response with status code 500. There are many status code, but for now, these are most useful. Don't worry, with practice, you will remember all those status code. Now for passing the status code with our response, we can add here multiple cursor. So press Alt or Option and simply click where we want multiple cursor. And here we add dot status, and in this with status code we want to pass for invalid data. We pass 400 and that's it. Press Escape for remove multiple cursor, and that's how we can pass status code with our request. Also, if we successfully create data, then we return response with status 201. Save the changes and take a look. Send the request again and see, here we get error status code 400 bad request. Lovely. Now till now, we are sending the response using response.send method. But this response.send method is used for general purpose, which means in this response.send method, we can send any type of content like plain text, HTML, or we can also pass JSON data. Now when we create API in Node, most of the time we want to return data in the JSON format, because it is much easier to handle. So here in the response, we have another method called response.json. This will automatically convert our data in the JSON format, and also it will set header content type to application/JSON. Don't worry, if you don't know about header content type, we will see that in the next section. So we will use response.send for simple responses, whether text, HTML or objects, and we will use response.json when we want to ensure that the response is in JSON format and properly formatted for JSON clients. Both works almost the same, but for JSON data, response is more convenient. So in the first GET request, we want to send the plain text. So we use here response.send. After that, we want to send to do array. So we can use here response.json. Next, also we want to send object, then what we will use? Right, we use response.json. And let's also remove this console. We don't need consoles in our server. It is just for testing. Next, here we are returning error. First, we change this send with JSON, JSON, and JSON. and it's better we pass that error in object. So wrap this string in object and simply add here message property and colon. Same we do for this error and also for this last error. And when we successfully creating a new to-do, then we are returning the new to-do object. So we also change the send with JSON. Make sure you don't pass plain text in the response.json method. It will give you error. Save the changes, and in the previous testing, go to the header section. Here we get bunch of details, but for now we need this content type. See, it is set to text/html. Now let's send another invalid post request. See, here we get the object which we sent with message property, and now if we check our content type, see, it is set to JSON. So use response.send for plain text or HTML and use response.json for sending JSON data. Now let's create an API for updating our single to-do. Suppose we want to update text of task or we want to update the status. So here we want to update little details about our current data, or we can also update all the information. So it's better we use here put request. Also, you can use your patch method, it's totally fine. So app.put endpoint to /todos. Now here we need the to-do ID which we want to update. So we add here route parameter :ID. After that, we add callback function with request and response. Now first of all, let's get the ID parameter. So const ID equals to request.params.id. And we know that this ID is string. So we wrap it with parse integer function. Now our first task is we have to find which element of the array has this ID. And then by that element index, we can change other values very easily. So for finding the index, we use todos array.findIndex method. Here we get single to do object in this t, and then we pass condition t.id should equals to our id parameter. This expression returns the index of the element, so we store it in variable called to do index. Now what if user pass id which is not available in our array? At the time, this to do index value will become -1, because this findIndex method returns -1 if we don't found the to do index. So here we pass if condition to do index is equals to -1. Then we return response.status 404 which is not found, and then .json, and we send object with property message and simply return here message to do not found. Make sure you add here this return. Great. Now suppose we found the to do index, then we have to update that element fields with our new data passed with API request. So at the top, first we get data from request.body and store that object in to do variable. Now instead of defining 3 different variables, we can use here object destructuring. So at the place of variable name, we can simply add curly brackets and write our property names which passed in the request.body. So first we get task, then text, and then status. And that's it. This single line of code works the same as these 3 lines of code. Now in the update, not every time we change task or we only change status. We can change any of these 3 properties. And our front end should pass only those properties in the body of the request which they want to change. So here we can do something like this. If task is available, then we update to-dos array to-do index.task is equal to task. So if this task is available in the body request, only then this line will update the task property. Let's duplicate this if condition 2 more times. Let's replace this task with tags, and tags. Also this one status, here also status, and that's it. Also here we are missing one thing. Can you tell me? Right, we have to return response at the end of this function. So response.json, and here we send our updated to do object. So to do's array in square bracket to do index. Save the changes and let's test this implementation. So go to Thunder client and create a new request. Write our endpoint which is http localhost :3000/todos/. Here we pass to do id, let's say 1. Change this get method to put method, and let's pass data in the request body. Object with property task and value to this is the updated task, and simply send the request. See, here we getting the updated data. And if we pass here id 10 and send the request, then we get here error message not found. You can see how simple it is to create API. Also, if you want to save your test, then press Ctrl+S or Command+S, and then from here we can also rename our test request update to do. Now it is time for interesting exercise. You have to create API for deleting the specific to-do using its ID. This is a lot easy exercise. Exercise will help you to learn fast and also boost your confidence. And even if you can't complete the whole exercise, at least try to solve it, because that's how you know on which part you have to work more. So give it a try and then watch the solution. So I hope you solve this exercise, or at least try to solve it. Now let's quickly see the solution. So here we define a new API using app.delete because we are deleting data here. Endpoint slash to-dos slash :id, callback, request, response, and arrow function. Now first of all, we get the ID from the route parameter. So const ID equals to request.params.id, and simply wrap it with parse integer function. This parse integer practice is very useful because when I am learning Node.js, this one mistake I repeat a lot. So make sure you don't repeat this mistake. Now here also, first we have to find the index of the to-do object which has this ID. So from the put method, we copy this variable line and also we copy this condition for not found and paste them in our delete method. Now after that, we have to simply remove that specific to-do from our to-dos array. So for that, we use to-dos array.splice method. In this, we have to pass two arguments. First, which index we want to remove, which is this to-do index. And second argument is how many elements we want to remove from this index. Suppose we have index value 2 and here we pass 3. So this splice method will remove 3 elements with the index 2 and also it will remove the element with index 3 and 4. In our case, we just want to remove this single element. So we pass here 1 and at the end we simply return response.json and here we pass success message. So object with message property and value to do deleted successfully. Save the changes and let's also test this delete request. Create a new request, change the URL to http://localhost:3000/todos/let's delete the task with ID 1. Select delete method and here we don't want to pass anything in our request body, so send this request. See, here we get success message, which means our task 1 is removed from our to-dos array. Now if we again send the request with the same ID, see, here we get not found. Lovely. You can see creating APIs is not that much difficult, and in this section we created get, post, put, delete, all CRUD APIs. So I hope you understand how to use Express and create REST APIs with Express. Now in the next section we will learn some advanced concepts of Express. So see you in the next section. So let's start with middleware. So what is middleware? In Express, middleware is a function that either call the next middleware function or send a response to end the current request. In simple words, whichever function who call the next middleware function or send a response to end the request, that function is called as middleware. Now let me ask you one question. Think about this callback function which we pass here. Can we call this function as middleware? Yes, because this function is sending a response to end this GET request. So when our frontend send request to any API endpoint, that request pass through a tunnel or pipeline in which all our middleware functions are placed in order. This pipeline is called as request processing pipeline. Suppose here we define middleware 1, middleware 2, and last middleware 3 will send response to end the request. Now when frontend sends API request, first this middleware 1 function will run. After that will pass our request to next middleware 2. And after completing the execution, middleware 2 will pass this request to middleware 3 which will send the response. Our server will maintain this order. If we get error in middleware 1, then other two middlewares will not run. Simple as that. Here are some common tasks for middleware. First one, it is used to log the request details. Also, it is used to check user who sent the request is logged in or not. This is the most common and best use case of middleware. Don't worry, we will see that in the user authentication section. Now last common task for middleware is passing the incoming data, which we already done. Remember? Yes, this express.json is a middleware function which is passing the incoming data into JSON format and then pass our request to next middleware function, which is this main function. Now you might ask why we need these middlewares. Can we write all code in the single function? For that, imagine we are creating backend for social media application. We have one API which is used to create a new post. Now we want to set condition for this request. Only logged in users can create a new post. If user is not logged in, we will return an error, please logged in with your account. Now we have another API which is used to add likes in the single post. In this API, we also want the same condition which is user must logged in. So here we have to again add that same code. Now instead of repeating this logged in verification code, we can define it in one middleware function and simply add that middleware for all the secured APIs. By this way, we don't need to repeat our code. And also, using middleware, we divide our code in small pieces and that will make our code clean and more readable. Also, by middleware, we can stop unwanted users' request to access the protected routes. So to quickly recap, middleware is a function that either call the next middleware function or send a response to end the current request. We can see middleware is very useful for any node application. So in the next lesson, we will see how to build middlewares. Now let's create our own custom middleware. It is really exciting and simple. So here in our application, we already added express.json middleware using app.use. Now after that, we add another app.use method, and in that, we will add our middleware function. So this app.use method is used to add middleware globally to our request processing pipeline. Now inside this use method, we pass callback function. This callback function has 3 parameters: request, response, and next. Now you might ask, we know request and response, but what is the next parameter? So this next parameter is used to call next middleware function. Now inside this callback function, we write our logic. Let's say we want to console.log our request methods and endpoints. So in the template string, we add $curly brackets request.method $curly brackets request.url. Now here is the one thing. In every custom middlewares which we defined, at the last part, we have to call this next function. Otherwise, our request will stuck in this middleware and user don't get the response. Let me show you that practically. Save the changes and back to our Thunder client. Let me open this request and send the request. Oh, sorry, I forgot to run this application using nodemon. Make sure your application is also running in the terminal. So nodemon index.js, good, and now we send this request. See, it is processing. And if we open our terminal, see, here we get the console of that request, which proves that our middleware function is called. So our current request processing pipeline is like this. First we have express.json middleware, then we have custom middleware, and then we have the last middleware function, which returns the response. Now when we don't call here next middleware function, our request will stuck here in this middleware, and it shows us processing state, which makes our whole application slow. That's why always remember, in every custom middleware, it's necessary to call next middleware function or we return the response. So here we call next middleware function. Save the changes and take a look. Now if we again send the request, see, here we get the response, and in the console, we also get the request log. So that's how simple to define our custom middleware function. I know this is very basic middleware function, but in the future, we will create custom middleware which checks our user is logged in or not. Also, when we define our middleware using app.use method, that middleware will apply for all API calls, just like this express.json middleware.
Stop taking meeting notes and let ClickUp AI Note Taker do it for you. It allows you to focus on your meetings, not your notes. It captures everything, from action items to key decisions. And after every call, you get a clear summary. But where it really goes to the next level is that it's...
In Express, we have very few built-in middlewares. We already use one of the built-in middleware, which is express.json. This middleware parses our request body data into JSON format. Without using this middleware, we can't get data into request.body. Do you remember? We got nothing in request.body. Now another useful built-in middleware is URL encoded. This is the similar built-in middleware like express.json. Express.json middleware used to parse JSON data, and express.url encoded middleware used to parse URL encoded data. This URL encoded data format is usually used when data is sent through simple HTML forms using the post method. In simple words, these both middlewares are used to extract data from the request. When our request has JSON data, then Express use JSON middleware, and when our request has data in URL encoded format, then Express use this URL encoded middleware. Both middleware functions simplify the process of accessing request data, so we don't need to manually parse it. Simple as that. Now let's see how to add URL encoded middleware in our application. It is really simple. We add here app.use, and inside this we call express.url encoded function. Save the changes and let's see this middleware is working or not. So we go to the post request. Previously we are sending data using this JSON format. Now here we have another option which is form encoded. Here we pass data in key value pair like task, and here we add our text. This is new encoded task. After that we want to pass text, which is array, and in that we pass HTML and CSS. And at last we want to pass status, which is to do. Now let's simply send this request. See, here we get new data created with status 201. So our URL encoded is working. But wait a minute, here we get this weird syntax of this array. Actually, it is not array. Our server stores this array as string. See, it is quoted in double quotes, which means it is string. Now why this happen? So when we want to pass array or object in form encoded format, we have to add additional setting in our middleware. So here in the URL encoded middleware, we add object with single property, extended to true. Save these, and in the post request, instead of pass this array in single field, we have to pass it in different fields. Like our array name is text, so we write text, and here we add square brackets, which indicate it is an array, and then we pass values in multiple fields. First we write HTML, after that we add another key value pair, Again, text, square bracket, and we write another value, CSS. And at last, we pass text, square bracket, and JavaScript. Now you understand why developers stop using this form encoded format. JSON format is much easier to pass and test. See, now we get our text array. Also, let's see if we remove extended property from the middleware, still it is working or not. I just want to see. Oh, it is not working. See, here we are getting tags are required, which means we are not getting tags. In previous Node versions, this might work, but as we are using here latest Node version, it is not working. So it's better to make it extended to true. Simple as that. Now you might have question, which middleware should we add in our Node.js project? Express.json or Express URL encoded? In modern world, 90% developers are using JSON format for data, so JSON middleware is common. But if you don't know in which format your frontend will send request data, JSON or form encoded, then adding both middlewares is beneficial for you. Now let's see another built-in middleware which is used to send static files from the server. If you don't know static files, then static files are simply assets which our frontend needs, like HTML files, CSS files, JavaScript files, text files, images, fonts, PDF, etc. They are called static because our server doesn't modify or process those files before sending them to the client. For example, we have the logo of our company in the server. So we will send that logo file to our frontend and frontend will display on website. Now you might think, we have static file on server. How can we share it? Don't worry, it is really simple. Let me show you that. Here we use app.use. Now for sharing the static files from the server, we have to use another built-in middleware called express.static. And inside this function, we have to pass the folder name which we want to share. Most commonly, developers called it public. You can call it whatever you like, but public is a common convention. Now you might ask, we don't have this public folder in our project, so we have to create it called public. Make sure you write the same name as you give your folder. And also, make sure that folder is available in root of the project, not into any other folder. Now for demo, we will add here any type of file or image. So here I have this image. I download this and add it in my public folder. And let's rename this file as Firewatch or anything you want to call it. Good. Now as we set our public folder as static, we can access all files which are available inside this folder. So open a browser and here we write our base URL localhost :3000/ and after that we can write our file name which we want to access, firewatch.webp. If your image file extension is PNG or JPG, then you have to write the same file extension. Here I don't get the file. What is wrong? Oh, we forgot to save these changes. Now again, try to access this file. See, here we get our image. So we will add all our static files into public folder and we can access them directly here. Our frontend will use this URL to show images, fonts or anything. Also, in our application, we can define one or more than one static folder. Like some developers like to add here assets folder, so we can duplicate this middleware and simply replace folder name by assets. Just make sure that folder is available in the root. Now many developers like to add prefix for static file path. So currently, we are accessing our static files directly after localhost :3000. By adding prefix, it will look like this: localhost :3000/static/firewatch.webp or localhost :3000/avatar/firewatch.webp, etc. Let me show you how we can do that. For that, we just add here our prefix before our express.static middleware /avatar. Save the changes, and if we refresh our page, see, we don't get here static file. We have to add /avatar in the URL. And now we get our static files. So that's how we can share static files from the server. Currently, if we see our index.js file, it feels we really messed up our code. Everything looks very cluttered and not maintainable. So let's structure our node application which is used in the real world. So currently, we added all to-do related APIs in the single index.js file. Imagine in another e-commerce application, we have another set of API for users, or we have another set of APIs for cart related features. At that time, we can't add all those APIs in the same index.js file. So the solution is, we can create a separate folder called routes, and in that, we will add files for that each set of APIs. So we create a new folder called routes. This is common practice for application structure. Now here, we create a new file called todos.js, in which we will define all API routes related to to-dos. First of all, let's cut all routes from the index.js file and paste it in the todos.js file. Now you might ask, in the index.js file, at the top, we have app instance, and using that, we define different API routes. But here, in the todos.js file, we don't have that app instance. So how can we define routes here? You might say we can recreate the app instance, but that is not possible. It will not work. So in the Express, we have another instance called router, by which we can define API endpoints just like we are defining APIs using app instance. So here we first import Express, const Express is equal to require Express. Now in this Express, we have another method called router, which will return the router instance, and that's why we store it in variable called router. Now let's simply replace this app instance by this router instance. So select this app and press Ctrl plus D or Command plus D, which will select all app instance and replace it with router. Good. Now we have defined our routes in the different file. But how our index.js file will know these routes we want to add in our application? For that, we have to export this router instance from this file and we add it in the index.js file. Simple as that. So do you remember how can we export variables from the node file? Right, we use module.exports is equal to router. Save this file, and in the index.js file, let's remove these blocks, we don't need them, and we add here app.use for adding those routes in our application. Here, at the first position, we add router prefix, same as this static file. Most of the time, developers like to add here /API. After that, at the second argument, we pass our router instance from the todos.js file. So at the top, we import that router using require function. And here we pass our file path, which is ./routes/todos. Now as we know, this require function will return router instance. So we can store it in variable called todos routes. And at the bottom, here we pass todos routes. And done. Also, I found we need this todos array in the todos file. So we cut it from here and paste it in our todos file. Save the changes and let's check our application is working well or not. Remember, for all to-do routes, we need to add prefix /API before endpoints. Send the request. See, it is working. Now one last change I want to do is, in our todos route, we can see we are adding /todos before every route endpoint. So we can commonly pass that /todos at the prefix in the index.js file. Save this. Now in todos.js file, we can remove /todos from the endpoint. Also, we remove todos for all API endpoints. Save this and we are good to go. We can also remove these unwanted lines. We don't need them. See, now our index.js file looks clean and more maintainable. So that's all about this Express crash course. I hope you learned about Express and how to build RESTful APIs, middlewares and much more. If you like this crash course and if you like to learn more about Node.js and backend development, then you can check out my full Node.js course in which you will learn to build real-world backend applications using Node.js, Express and MongoDB. Also, we will implement features like pagination, infinite query, payment integration, error handling, sending emails from the backend, authentication, one-to-one chat features, group chats using Socket, and much more with 3 real-world backend projects. Link is down in the description.
Baik, sepertinya cukup sampai di sini saja untuk video kali ini. Saya Ras Sidik pamit undur diri. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.